The Senate chamber fell silent. The weight of history hung in the air as Joe Manchin, self-proclaimed Democrat, longtime ally of the working class, stood in opposition to a bill that could alter the very trajectory of America's future. His words were deliberate, cold, and, to the growing number of critics, utterly incomprehensible. "I cannot, in good conscience, support this," he declared, his voice dripping with the polished arrogance of a man who had long ago chosen corporate interests over the common good. The bill, a sweeping climate initiative designed to reduce emissions and move the country toward renewable energy, was, in Manchin's eyes, too radical. Too costly. Too much of a threat to the coal industry he'd spent years defending. And yet, as he spoke, something shifted in the room. A flicker of movement, a surge of energy, caught the attention of everyone present. Bernie Sanders, standing at the edge of the chamber, his face set in grim determination, pushed his way through the sea of lawmakers. His steps were deliberate, each one echoing with the weight of decades spent fighting for what he believed was right. This was no longer about a bill. It was about the future of the planet. The tension was palpable. Sanders, the man who had been relentlessly pushing for climate action long before it was fashionable, wasn't about to let Manchin's corporate-backed opposition derail this fight. He stepped to the microphone, his presence a stark contrast to Manchin's, exuding the quiet strength of a man who had nothing left to lose. The moment hung in the air. "Senator Manchin," Bernie began, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "you've made your money. You've taken your donations. But let me be clear, this bill is about the future of our children. This is about what kind of world we leave behind." The room held its breath. "What happens next, America?" Sanders' words echoed, each one landing like a call to action. "Will we choose to protect our planet, or will we bow to the greed that's poisoning it?" What happened next left the entire country in disbelief. The debate in the Senate wasn't just about numbers on a page or political maneuvering, it was about something much bigger. Much more urgent. The bill in question wasn't simply another policy proposal, it was the last, best chance to stave off the impending collapse of our planet. Global warming wasn't a theoretical concept anymore. It wasn't something that could be debated or downplayed in a textbook. It was right in front of us, the devastating wildfires in California, the record-breaking heat waves in the Midwest, the coastal cities slowly sinking beneath the waves. It was happening, right now. And yet, in that Senate chamber, where decisions were being made that would shape the future, there were those who would rather protect the status quo, the industries that had spent decades poisoning the air, the water, and the future of every living creature on Earth. This climate bill wasn't just about curbing emissions. It was about creating a sustainable future, a world that was capable of healing. If passed, it would accelerate the switch to renewable energy, create thousands of green jobs, and put America back on the map as a leader in global climate policy. It wasn't just the right thing to do, it was the only thing to do. But there was a problem. Some of the most powerful voices in Washington, voices that had been bought and paid for by fossil fuel companies, were working overtime to sink it. And there, in the middle of it all, was Joe Manchin, standing tall as the biggest obstacle. A man whose pockets were lined with millions from coal, oil, and gas companies, corporations whose interests were directly at odds with the survival of the planet. He had long been the self-styled defender of the working class, but in reality, he was nothing more than a puppet for the industries that had no intention of letting go of their stranglehold on the economy. The Democratic Party, once the champion of progressive values, was at a crossroads. The battle wasn't just about the climate bill anymore, it was about the party's soul. Would it stand on the right side of history? Would it choose a future where America led the world in combating climate change? Or would it fall victim to the corporate interests that had financed the careers of so many in power? Bernie Sanders had always believed that this fight was more than just politics, it was a moral obligation. The future of our children, of our planet, depended on the outcome. This wasn't some partisan skirmish. This was about the survival of life as we knew it. As he looked across the room, Sanders saw a wall of opposition. Manchin, along with a handful of his colleagues, was determined to block this bill, to keep the money flowing into their pockets at the expense of everyone else. But Sanders wasn't backing down. Not now. Not when the stakes were this high. If this bill failed, it would set a dangerous precedent, one that would embolden those who didn't care about the environment or future generations. The consequences would be catastrophic: more hurricanes, more droughts, more devastation. For every family on the coast, every community struggling with polluted water and toxic air, this was their last hope. Would America rise to the occasion? Would the Senate do what was right, or would greed and corruption continue to reign? The fate of the nation was hanging by a thread. And Bernie Sanders was ready to fight for it, no matter the cost. But the real question was, would anyone else stand with him? Joe Manchin's rise to power was anything but accidental. His political career was carefully crafted, each move calculated to build a narrative of moderation and pragmatism, qualities that served him well in a state like West Virginia, where the coal industry had deep roots. But beneath the surface of this self-styled moderate was a man who had long since sold out the values he once claimed to represent. Manchin wasn't just a product of his state's political machine, he was the machine. West Virginia, once a hub of industry, had been in decline for decades. The coal mines that once fueled America's economy had become a shell of their former selves. Yet, in Joe Manchin, the coal industry found a champion. As a young man, he inherited a family business, the very kind of business that had come to symbolize the exploitation of natural resources for personal gain. His family's coal empire may have been dwindling, but his political empire was on the rise, and the two were deeply intertwined. From the start, Manchin's career was shaped by his cozy relationship with the coal industry. He was a firm believer that coal would always be the backbone of West Virginia's economy, and anyone who disagreed was simply naive or uninformed. It didn't matter that the world was changing, that the climate was warming, that the jobs in the coal mines were disappearing. Manchin's loyalty wasn't to the people of West Virginia, it was to the industry that had funded his campaigns and lined his pockets for years. He knew exactly what he was doing. As a young state legislator, Manchin quickly learned how to manipulate the system. He played both sides of the aisle, carefully crafting a persona of a bipartisan, down-the-middle politician who could work with anyone, for anything. But in reality, he was playing a dangerous game. His corporate backers, the fossil fuel companies, the gas giants, the coal barons, kept the checks coming, and in return, Manchin delivered. He voted against regulations that would hurt the industry, ensured subsidies flowed freely to coal plants, and was the voice of moderation when any real change threatened the status quo. It was easy for him to paint himself as a moderate Democrat, someone who could talk about the need for jobs and economic growth while shielding his true loyalties. He wrapped himself in the mantle of the working-class hero, always promising that he would fight for the people. But every time the winds of change blew, every time the conversation turned toward a future that didn't involve fossil fuels, Manchin stood in the way. By the time he reached the U.S. Senate, Joe Manchin had perfected the art of political survival. He wasn't just a representative of West Virginia, he was a representative of the coal industry, of corporate greed, of the old guard that had been clinging to power for decades. He positioned himself as the last true defender of the American worker, even as he fought tooth and nail to prevent progress on climate change, health care, or any issue that might upset his donors' interests. His arrogance was evident in every public appearance. The way he would casually dismiss the concerns of younger generations about the environment, the way he would ridicule climate change activists as idealists who didn't understand the realities of the working class. "I'm a Democrat, but I'm not a socialist," he'd say, a smirk on his face. His dismissiveness wasn't just a rhetorical device, it was a deliberate effort to silence the voices of those calling for change. Those who didn't have the power to buy his loyalty were left unheard, while his wealthy donors were given a front-row seat to every legislative decision. Manchin's contradictions were glaring. On one hand, he presented himself as a defender of the working class, but his record told a different story. He voted against climate change initiatives that would have created green jobs, while enthusiastically supporting tax breaks for the wealthiest corporations. He promised to support the people of West Virginia but consistently voted in favor of policies that harmed the very people he claimed to protect. And with every vote, his ties to the fossil fuel industry grew stronger. By 2021, Manchin had become one of the largest recipients of donations from oil, gas, and coal industries in the Senate. He had become so entangled in their web that even the smallest concession to environmental progress was a threat to his power. And yet, he remained untouchable, wrapped in the cloak of his political success. He reveled in his position as the kingmaker, holding the balance of power in the Senate, the man who could make or break the future of climate legislation with a single vote. He played the game, and he played it well, but he wasn't playing for the people. He was playing for himself, for the corporations that lined his pockets, and for the legacy he hoped to leave. For years, Joe Manchin had walked the tightrope between being a moderate Democrat and a corporate pawn. But with each step, he became more entangled in the web of corporate donations and industry favors, selling out the very people he claimed to represent. To Manchin, the future of West Virginia wasn't about clean energy, jobs for the next generation, or environmental sustainability. It was about maintaining the status quo, about keeping the money flowing, about securing his own power. But in that Senate chamber, with the fate of the climate bill hanging in the balance, the true cost of his choices would be exposed. The world was watching. The stakes were higher than ever. And Joe Manchin, for all his years of manipulation and deceit, was about to face the consequences of his arrogance. And Bernie Sanders, the man who had spent a lifetime fighting for change, wasn't going to let him, or the fossil fuel industry, win. Bernie Sanders was never meant to be a politician in the traditional sense. He didn't come from a family of political power brokers or wealthy donors. He didn't have the connections or the money to run the kind of campaigns that would make him a household name. What he had, instead, was a fierce belief in the power of the people, a belief that had shaped him since his earliest days in Brooklyn, New York. Growing up in a working-class Jewish family, Bernie saw firsthand the challenges faced by ordinary people. His father, a Polish immigrant, struggled to make ends meet, working long hours to provide for his family. There was no silver spoon, no easy path to success. Just hard work, sacrifice, and the unyielding belief that if you worked hard enough, you could build a better life. It was this spirit that Bernie carried with him when he left home to attend college, and it was this spirit that would eventually shape the course of his political career. But Bernie's worldview was never shaped by the typical American dream narrative. Instead, it was shaped by the injustices he saw around him. While other young people were chasing prosperity, Bernie was chasing fairness. His time at the University of Chicago during the 1960s, a period of political upheaval and civil rights activism, exposed him to a world where inequality was rampant, and the system was rigged against the most vulnerable. He saw the horrors of segregation, the violence of the Vietnam War, and the systemic oppression that many Americans faced every day. This didn't just change him, it defined him. It was in this environment that Bernie first began his activism, organizing protests, advocating for civil rights, and standing up against the war. But while many of his peers in the 60s moved toward the corporate world or established political paths, Bernie remained committed to the fight for justice, knowing that true change would only come when power was wrestled from the hands of the few and placed in the hands of the many. When Bernie returned to Vermont in the early 1970s, he became involved in local politics, eventually being elected as the mayor of Burlington in 1981. His approach was radically different from the establishment politicians who dominated the scene. Rather than focusing on the typical political agendas, Bernie centered his efforts on improving the lives of everyday people, working-class families, the homeless, the elderly. He fought for affordable housing, better healthcare, and access to education. For Bernie, it wasn't about power or popularity, it was about creating tangible change that improved people's lives. But it wasn't just in local politics where Bernie's passion for justice was on display. His political vision was always intertwined with his commitment to the environment. Bernie understood, from the very beginning, that the fight for the planet was inseparable from the fight for social justice. He recognized that the industries polluting the earth were also the industries exploiting the most vulnerable people, those who didn't have the resources to fight back, those who would bear the brunt of climate change's devastating effects. In the 1980s, as environmental movements began gaining traction, Bernie took an active role in advocating for climate action. He called for sweeping environmental reforms long before it became a popular cause in mainstream politics. While many politicians were content to talk about environmental issues in the abstract, Bernie was already pushing for concrete policies that would protect workers, create green jobs, and ensure that environmental protections were at the forefront of every political debate. He knew that climate change wasn't just about polar bears or melting glaciers, it was about the future of every worker, every family, every community that would suffer if nothing was done. Bernie's commitment to climate action only deepened when he was elected to the House of Representatives in 1991. As a congressman, he quickly became known for his uncompromising stance on environmental issues. He wasn't afraid to call out the corporate interests that were poisoning the planet, and he wasn't afraid to challenge the powerful forces that sought to block meaningful environmental reform. Over the years, Bernie continued to advocate for bold climate policies that would dramatically reduce emissions, transition the country to renewable energy, and invest in green technology. But as the years passed, Bernie realized that the fight for the climate was not just a matter of policy, it was a matter of survival. Unlike Manchin, Bernie's life was defined by service to the public. From his early days as a young mayor to his time in Congress, Bernie had always been about fighting for the working class. He saw the struggles of everyday people as his own, and he knew that climate change would affect those same people the most. The coal miners in West Virginia, the farmers in the Midwest, the families in low-income neighborhoods, they were the ones who would pay the price for inaction, just as they had paid the price for decades of corporate greed and exploitation. As Bernie transitioned to the Senate in 2007, his fight for the climate took on even greater urgency. He recognized that the stakes had never been higher. The effects of climate change were already being felt around the world, and the time for incremental change had long passed. Bernie wasn't interested in half measures or band-aid solutions. He knew that what was needed was a revolutionary shift in how America approached climate policy. He called for a Green New Deal, a comprehensive plan to transition the country to renewable energy, create millions of green jobs, and protect the most vulnerable communities from the devastating effects of climate change. Bernie's worldview was clear: climate change wasn't just an environmental issue, it was a moral issue. It was a fight for justice, a fight for the future of the planet, and a fight for the most vulnerable among us. Bernie didn't have a hidden agenda. He wasn't beholden to corporate donors or industry insiders. His commitment to the climate was genuine, and his decades of fighting for the people made him the natural leader in this battle. As the fight for the climate bill in the Senate intensified, Bernie understood that this was the moment that would define his legacy. This wasn't just another policy debate. This was the battle for the future of the planet, and Bernie Sanders was ready to fight, to give everything he had, to ensure that the next generation would inherit a world that was habitable, sustainable, and just. This was the fight of his life, and he wasn't about to back down now. The tension in the Senate chamber was palpable, each word exchanged hanging in the air like a spark waiting to ignite. On one side stood Bernie Sanders, unwavering and resolute, his voice calm but carrying the weight of decades of activism and belief in climate justice. On the other, Joe Manchin, dressed in his trademark suit, exuded arrogance. He shifted in his seat, glancing across the room, his posture defensive yet defiant. This was no longer just a debate, it was a fight for the future of the country, and Manchin was determined to win at any cost. Manchin's opening remarks were filled with the same tired defenses he had used countless times before. "This bill, as it stands, is too costly," he said, shaking his head as if the rest of the chamber were simply unaware of the realities of the world. "We can't afford to sacrifice our economy for some abstract notion of a green future. We have to be pragmatic." But Bernie wasn't having it. He stood, his eyes steady as he looked directly at Manchin. "The reality, Joe, is that if we don't act now, our economy won't survive. The cost of inaction will be far greater than any price tag attached to this bill. Climate change is not some theoretical crisis. It's happening right now. And if you can't see that, then you're ignoring the very people you claim to represent. The room fell silent. Manchin's face flushed, but he didn't let up. Bernie, you don't understand. You've never had to make the tough calls. You're out there, talking about saving the planet, while people in my state are struggling to feed their families. These policies are a pipe dream. Bernie's jaw clenched, but he remained calm. He had heard it all before. This was the defense of corporate interests, the same arguments made by the oil and gas industry for decades. Bernie's voice grew firmer, his eyes narrowing. The people in your state, Joe, are the ones who will suffer most if we don't act. They're already facing the consequences of a broken system, a system that you've helped prop up for years. The coal industry has destroyed your state, and you continue to let them get away with it. Manchin scoffed, clearly irritated. You don't get it, Bernie. It's not about coal, it's about jobs. You're pushing us toward a future that doesn't account for the people who've been the backbone of this country. But Bernie wasn't about to back down. It's about more than jobs, Joe. It's about survival. Your coal jobs are disappearing, and if you don't acknowledge that, then you're condemning your people to a future of poverty and environmental collapse. This bill, this Green New Deal, is about creating jobs in renewable energy, in wind, solar, green technology. It's about building a future where people aren't left behind. Manchin's eyes narrowed as he shot back. You think renewable energy will solve everything? It's not that simple, Bernie. The world doesn't work the way you think it does. You can't just wave a magic wand and change everything overnight. Bernie leaned in, his voice steady but laced with growing intensity. I'm not talking about magic, Joe. I'm talking about action. I'm talking about doing what's right for future generations. You're so caught up in protecting the interests of the fossil fuel industry that you can't see the bigger picture. You're blinded by their money. Your donors are the ones telling you to stand in the way of progress. You're the ones standing in the way of a future where your children and grandchildren can live in a world that's still habitable. The room went silent as Bernie's words hung in the air. Manchin's face twisted with indignation, his teeth gritting, but there was no easy defense against what Bernie had just said. The realization hit the room like a thunderclap, the moral high ground wasn't on Manchin's side. It was on Bernie's. Let me make this clear, Joe, Bernie continued, his voice unwavering, this isn't about what's convenient for you or your corporate backers. This is about the future of our children. The future of this planet. You've spent years taking donations from the very industries that are poisoning the earth. And now, when the people need you most, when we have the chance to make real, meaningful change, you're blocking it. Manchin shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The deflection wasn't working. The veneer of moderation he had so carefully crafted was beginning to crack. Bernie wasn't merely questioning his stance, he was exposing his hypocrisy. Every vote, every policy decision that Manchin had made over the years, was laid bare for all to see. For a moment, it seemed as if the room held its breath, waiting for Manchin to respond. But Bernie's calm demeanor, his fact-based argument, his clear vision of a future rooted in justice, stood in stark contrast to Manchin's growing panic and defensiveness. The contrast between them had never been clearer. Bernie had always been about service to the people, while Manchin had made a career out of serving corporate greed. Manchin finally spoke, his voice tight with frustration. You're wrong, Bernie. You're wrong about everything. But Bernie wasn't finished. The only thing that's wrong, Joe, is the fact that you've ignored the truth for so long. And now, because of your selfishness, the future of our planet is on the line. The room was split. Some eyes were glued to Bernie, admiration in their gaze. Others darted to Manchin, his corporate allies visibly squirming. The moral clarity of Bernie's argument, the unshakable righteousness of his position, was undeniable. It was no longer about the bill. It was about the fundamental values that defined this fight. The debate was far from over, but it was clear which side had the truth on its side. And the clash that had just begun would shake the very foundations of Washington itself. But what Bernie didn't yet know was that Manchin wasn't finished yet, and his next move would throw everything into turmoil. The Senate chamber was electric, the air thick with tension. Bernie Sanders stood at the podium, his face resolute, his eyes locked on Joe Manchin, who was still reeling from the force of Bernie's last words. The room buzzed with anticipation, as if everyone could feel the storm about to break. Bernie knew that this was his moment, the moment when he could lay it all bare, when he could expose the truth that Manchin had spent years hiding. Manchin, desperate to regain control, shifted in his seat. He looked at his colleagues, searching for support, but there was none to be found. The mask was slipping. His corporate backers had never been so exposed, and the weight of Bernie's accusations hung over him like a shadow. The room was waiting for him to speak, but the words wouldn't come. For the first time, he was speechless, cornered by his own hypocrisy. Bernie's voice cut through the silence, deliberate and measured. "You want to talk about jobs, Joe? About saving the working class? Let's talk about jobs. Let's talk about the people you claim to protect, the coal miners, the factory workers, the families who've relied on industries that have been poisoning their homes for generations. You talk a big game about standing up for them, but you're not protecting them, Joe. You're protecting an industry that's dying. You're protecting fossil fuel companies that are killing your own people." Manchin's jaw tightened, but his gaze faltered. He wasn't prepared for this. Bernie's words were like daggers, and they were landing. He opened his mouth to respond, but Bernie continued, his voice rising in intensity. "Your constituents are dying, Joe. And you're protecting a dying industry," Bernie declared, his words slicing through the noise like a hot knife through butter. The room fell silent. The truth had been spoken. The mic drop wasn't just a metaphor, it was a reality that Manchin couldn't escape. "Let's talk about what you've really done for West Virginia," Bernie continued, his gaze unwavering. "You've taken millions from the fossil fuel industry. You've taken money from coal executives, from oil and gas giants, from companies whose sole interest is squeezing every last penny out of a dying planet. You've used that money to line your pockets, to keep the status quo intact. And in doing so, you've sold out your own people, Joe." The room was still, but you could feel the temperature rise. Bernie had exposed the core of Manchin's power, the corporate money that had fueled his political career. The truth was out, laid bare for all to see. Manchin's supporters shifted uncomfortably in their seats. His colleagues exchanged glances, the weight of Bernie's words sinking in. They knew this wasn't just a typical political disagreement, it was a moral reckoning. Bernie wasn't done. His voice grew even more resolute, every word pounding with conviction. "You can stand there and pretend to be a champion of the working class, Joe, but the reality is, you've sold your soul to the very industries that have been poisoning your state for years. You talk about the future of America, but you've done everything in your power to make sure that future is one where the wealthiest continue to profit while the rest of us suffocate in pollution, inequality, and climate disaster." Manchin's face reddened, but he could only stare at Bernie, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. He had been caught in a web of his own making, and there was no escaping it now. The audience, his colleagues, the nation, they were all seeing Manchin for what he truly was, a man who had prioritized corporate donations over the health and well-being of his own constituents. "The future, Joe," Bernie continued, "is not about fossil fuels. It's about clean energy. It's about renewable jobs. It's about a future where families don't have to worry about breathing toxic air, where communities aren't ravaged by oil spills and gas leaks. It's about a future where no one is left behind. And that future is what we're fighting for today." Bernie paused, his eyes scanning the room, ensuring that every word landed with the force it deserved. "But instead of fighting for that future, you've chosen to protect the corporations that have held us hostage for decades. And in doing so, you've condemned your own people to a future of poverty and environmental ruin." Manchin opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He was done. The carefully constructed facade of moderation and compromise he had built for years was crumbling, and there was no way to put it back together. Bernie had exposed him for who he really was, a puppet of the fossil fuel industry, a man who had sold his vote and his voice to the highest bidder. The room remained silent, the weight of Bernie's words hanging over them. The audience, both in the chamber and across the country, could feel the shift. The moral clarity of Bernie's argument was undeniable. The crowd was beginning to stir, a subtle undercurrent of support building for Bernie's stand. His speech had been a rallying cry, and the room knew it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Bernie spoke again, his voice softening, but still filled with passion. This bill isn't just a piece of legislation. It's a lifeline. It's a promise to our children and grandchildren that we will leave them a planet worth living on. A planet that's not suffocated by the greed of corporations, a planet that's not burning to the ground because we were too afraid to act. This is the fight of our lives. Manchin shifted in his seat again, clearly defeated, but he couldn't bring himself to respond. His credibility had shattered, piece by piece, under the weight of Bernie's counterattack. His ties to the fossil fuel industry, his refusal to acknowledge the urgency of climate action, his complete disregard for the well-being of his constituents, Bernie had torn it all down. The room erupted in applause. It wasn't just a reaction to Bernie's words, it was a recognition of the truth that had just been exposed. For the first time in years, the Senate wasn't just debating a bill. It was debating the future of the country. And the moral clarity of Bernie's position had tipped the scales. Manchin sat there, defeated, unable to respond. The villain had been unmasked, and the hero's stand had left an indelible mark on the room. The fight was far from over, but in that moment, Bernie Sanders had secured the moral high ground. And the world was watching, waiting to see if America would finally choose a future that embraced progress, not profit. The moment the Senate session ended, the impact was immediate. What had been a tense, high-stakes political showdown in the Senate chamber was now the hot topic of every news cycle, every social media thread, and every dinner table discussion across the country. Bernie Sanders had delivered his counterattack with surgical precision, and the fallout from that moment was felt like an earthquake, rippling outward in all directions. Within minutes, hashtags began to trend, one in particular rising to the top of the pile, #ManchinExposed. It spread like wildfire. On Twitter, the left-leaning commentators and activists pounced on the opportunity to spotlight Joe Manchin's corporate ties, his ties to the fossil fuel industry, and his hypocrisy. The outrage was palpable. This wasn't just about a debate anymore, it was a full-scale ideological battle, one that exposed the dark underbelly of American politics. Memes flooded the internet, a visual flood of images showing Manchin with coal dust on his hands, juxtaposed with Bernie's calm, almost prophetic demeanor. "A future worth fighting for," read one meme with a close-up of Bernie's face, his eyes resolute as he called out Manchin. "Corporate greed versus the planet's future," flashed across another. The internet, always quick to seize on a viral moment, had embraced Bernie's victory. The contrast between Bernie's moral clarity and Manchin's greed was laid bare for all to see, and the public was not about to let it slide into obscurity. Celebrities joined in the fray, adding their voices to the growing chorus. Naomi Klein, the renowned environmental activist, tweeted, "If the Senate truly cared about the future of this planet, it would stand with Bernie Sanders." #ManchinExposed is only the beginning of this fight. From the progressive side of Hollywood to environmental influencers on Instagram, the backlash against Manchin's corporate allegiances was swift, fierce, and widespread. The hashtag became a symbol of resistance to corporate power and a rallying cry for those who had long felt ignored by politicians like Manchin. But the firestorm wasn't confined to social media. Across major news outlets, anchors were dissecting the debate, pulling up clips of Bernie's mic drop moment, his words now echoing across the media landscape. CNN ran a segment with climate experts praising Bernie's clear-eyed vision for the future, contrasting it with the regressive stance of Manchin. MSNBC and The Guardian weighed in with articles, calling the moment a pivotal one in the fight for climate change legislation. Bernie Sanders versus Joe Manchin, "The Battle for America's Climate Future," became a common headline, underscoring the high stakes of the showdown. Politicians from across the spectrum, sensing the shifting winds, began to weigh in. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, rising star of the progressive wing, tweeted, "Today, Bernie showed us what leadership looks like. This is about our future, our children's future. We can't let fossil fuel money control our democracy any longer." Her tweet was shared thousands of times, amplified by progressives eager to see a complete overhaul of the political system that had been captured by corporate interests. On the other side of the aisle, members of the corporate wing of the Democratic Party scrambled to defend Manchin. But their voices, once influential, now seemed hollow, as if trying to shout over the roaring crescendo of the progressive movement. Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, was forced to release a statement in support of Manchin, though it sounded less like genuine support and more like a reluctant defense of a colleague who was no longer holding his ground. The growing divide within the Democratic Party could no longer be ignored. The consequences of this battle were becoming ever clearer. Bernie Sanders had become the face of progressive politics, and with that came a newfound sense of urgency. The war for the soul of the Democratic Party, and by extension, the nation, was now in full swing. The ideological rift between those fighting for bold action on climate change and those protecting the fossil fuel industry was widening by the hour. In the coming days, the debate would spill into town halls, into rallies, into the very streets of America. Bernie's victory wasn't just a policy win, it was an ideological and moral victory, one that showed the public where the true fight for the future of the country lay. Those who had been silent or complicit in allowing corporate interests to dictate climate policy could no longer pretend they didn't know the stakes. Bernie had brought the fight into the light. Even in Manchin's home state of West Virginia, whispers began to emerge. Progressive activists in the state were mobilizing, calling attention to the very real consequences of his votes, how his allegiance to coal and oil had kept West Virginians trapped in a cycle of poverty, disease, and environmental degradation. Social media posts began to appear, calling for Manchin's removal in the next election. The battle had shifted from the halls of the Senate to the streets of America, where the people were making their voices heard. Yet for all the momentum on Bernie's side, the fight was far from over. While the public had rallied around Bernie's call for climate action, the corporate interests that Manchin had represented weren't going down without a fight. The next phase of the battle would be even more intense. But one thing was certain, Bernie had taken a crucial step toward reshaping the political landscape. He had forced the issue of climate change into the spotlight in a way that couldn't be ignored. The divide between the progressives and corporate wings of the Democratic Party was no longer theoretical, it was real, and it was widening by the day. And while the war for the soul of the nation was just beginning, one thing had been made clear, Bernie Sanders wasn't going to stop fighting. Not now. Not ever. The question was no longer whether America would act on climate change, it was whether the corporate forces that had long controlled the conversation would be able to maintain their grip. And with every passing day, the answer seemed clearer. Bernie Sanders had ignited a movement, and the flames of change were only just beginning to spread. The days following the debate were a blur of media appearances, public speeches, and phone calls. But as Bernie Sanders stood in front of a crowd of thousands, the weight of everything that had just transpired began to settle in. The cameras were still flashing, the applause still ringing in his ears, but it wasn't the spotlight he craved, it was the truth he had just spoken, the movement he had ignited, and the larger battle at hand that now defined his mission. Bernie took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the sea of faces in front of him. He saw the hope in their eyes, the belief that real change was possible. These were the people who had stood with him, who had fought alongside him for years, who had joined the fight for a better future. Their energy was electric, their resolve palpable. They weren't just fighting for a single bill. They were fighting for a future they believed could still be saved. He thought back to the debate in the Senate, to the moment he had exposed Joe Manchin for what he truly was, a servant of corporate greed. That moment had been powerful, but it was more than just a political win. It had symbolized a shift in the narrative. It was no longer just about climate change, it was about standing up to the forces that had held power for far too long, the same forces that had poisoned the air, polluted the waters, and destroyed the very fabric of America's working class. Bernie's victory over Manchin wasn't just a victory over one man. It was a victory over an entire system that had placed profits above people, that had placed corporate interests above the health and well-being of everyday Americans. It was a victory for the millions of people who had been left behind by the establishment, for those who had been promised change but had seen nothing but the perpetuation of inequality and environmental devastation. That moment in the Senate had been a turning point, a moment when the people finally saw that their voices mattered, that their fight for justice was not in vain. But as Bernie stood on the stage before the crowd, he knew that the real battle was just beginning. The fight against climate change wasn't just about one bill or one debate, it was about changing the very system that had allowed corporate greed to thrive unchecked. It was about dismantling the influence of money in politics and reclaiming the power of democracy. The fight against climate change wasn't just about policy, it was about humanity itself. The future we're fighting for is not just about renewable energy or carbon emissions, Bernie said, his voice strong but filled with emotion. It's about the future of every person in this country. It's about making sure that every child has clean air to breathe and safe water to drink. It's about making sure that every community, no matter their background, no matter their zip code, has access to the opportunities they deserve. This fight is about justice. It's about dignity. And it's about standing up to the powerful forces that have tried to divide us for far too long. The crowd cheered, but Bernie's words were more than just a rallying cry, they were a call to action. The battle was not over. Bernie knew that the road ahead would be hard, and that there would be many more battles to fight. Manchin might have been defeated, but the corporate interests that controlled Washington were not going to back down. They would fight harder, use their influence, and dig in their heels. But Bernie also knew something that they didn't understand, the people were with him. The movement was growing. And with every passing day, it was becoming stronger. In the end, this fight isn't just about one bill, one policy, or even one election, Bernie continued. This fight is about the soul of America. It's about the values we hold dear. It's about whether we will allow the greed of a few to destroy the future of the many. We've already seen what happens when we put profits over people. But we're not going to let it happen again. As Bernie spoke, he could feel the energy in the crowd swell. These were the people who had been left behind, the people who had been ignored for far too long. They had been told that their voices didn't matter, that their concerns were too radical or too impossible. But now, with Bernie at the forefront, they had seen what was possible. They had seen that even in a system rigged by corporate interests, change was still possible. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick, but it was possible. And it was worth fighting for. Together, Bernie said, his voice steady, we are going to build a future where every single person in this country has the opportunity to thrive. A future where no one is left behind. A future where the planet we leave our children is a planet worth living on. That's the world I believe in. That's the world we can create. The crowd erupted in applause, their energy unmistakable. But Bernie knew that the applause wasn't just for him, it was for the idea that change was possible, for the belief that progress would prevail in the end. The battle had been hard, and it would continue to be. But as long as the people were with him, as long as they fought together, there was no force powerful enough to stop them. As Bernie looked out at the thousands of people who had supported him, he realized that the battle was never just about one bill, it was about taking a stand for the future. The fight against climate change wasn't just about policy, it was about humanity itself. It was about the fight for a world where justice, dignity, and truth triumphed over greed and corruption. And as long as he had breath in his body, Bernie Sanders would keep fighting for that future. Because, in the end, it was never just about the bill, it was about everything that came after it. And Bernie knew, deep in his heart, that this was just the beginning. The battle for climate justice is far from over. Bernie Sanders may have won the ideological fight, but the war is just beginning. The forces that want to maintain the status quo, that benefit from the destruction of our planet and the exploitation of its people, will fight harder than ever to hold on to their power. But Bernie's stand has ignited something much bigger, a movement fueled by everyday people who know that the time for change is now. This is our moment. The future of our planet, the future of our children, and the future of every community at the mercy of climate destruction depend on what we do next. Bernie's victory was just the first step, but it's up to all of us to keep pushing forward. We can no longer stand by while corporate greed and inaction take everything from us. The fight is long, and the road is hard, but the stakes couldn't be higher. Now, it's our turn. We are the ones who must carry this torch, who must continue the fight for climate justice, for dignity, and for the future of every person on this planet. Together, we have the power to create a sustainable, just future. A future where the environment is protected, where communities thrive, and where the next generation can inherit a world worth living in. So, here's what we need you to do: subscribe to this channel, share this video, and join the fight for a better tomorrow. Your voice matters. Your actions matter. The future is in our hands, and together, we can make it a future worth living for. Let's make sure Bernie's message lives on, and let's continue the fight for climate justice, because the planet's future, and our future, depends on it.